The toast was a violation, a cruelty polished to a high shine, offered up in a room glittering with candlelight and deceit. "To my dearest niece, Cassandra," Lady Lavinia Corbett announced, her voice a silken thread weaving through the clink of crystal at her dinner table. "May she find a match as brilliant as her beauty." All eyes turned to Cassandra Corbett, whose blonde curls and blue eyes were indeed brilliant. And then, as if pulled by an invisible string, every gaze slid past her to the man seated at Lady Lavinia's right, Lord Benedict Devereux, the recently widowed Duke of Kestrel Chase, the true object of the toast. He was a man carved from granite and grief, his presence filling the room with a cold, silent weight. He did not smile. He simply inclined his head, a gesture of civility so minimal it was almost an insult. From her place by the shadowed sideboard, where she stood ready to correct any error of the hired staff, Prudence Abbott watched it all. She was the other niece, the invisible one, the one whose labor made such evenings possible. It was Prudence who had stretched the household budget for the past 5 years to afford the imported wine they were drinking. It was Prudence who had personally restitched the fraying lace on Cassandra's gown that very afternoon. It was Prudence whose mind held the intricate, precarious architecture of her aunt's finances, a structure of debt and pretense she was commanded to maintain, but never acknowledge. Lady Lavinia, her guardian since her parents' passing, had long ago assessed Prudence's worth. She was not a commodity for the marriage market. She was an asset for the back office. Plain, quiet, with a mind for numbers and a refusal to complain, she was the perfect, unpaid steward for her aunt's crumbling estate and soaring social ambitions. Her value was in her invisibility. A small, sharp sound cut through the low hum of conversation. A footman, nervous under the Duke's cold gaze, had jostled a serving platter. A tureen of sauce, meant for the roasted pheasant, tipped precariously. Time seemed to slow. Prudence saw the footman's wide eyes, the drop of dark sauce hitting the pristine white tablecloth, the beginning of a stain that would mar the evening's performance. She saw her aunt's face tighten, a prelude to a storm that would break over the servant, and later Prudence herself, once the guests were gone. Before anyone else could react, Prudence moved. She did not rush. Her steps were silent and measured on the polished floor. She took a clean, folded napkin from the sideboard, her fingers deft. With one hand, she subtly steadied the tureen on the footman's tray, a silent, reassuring pressure. With the other, she placed the napkin over the spreading stain, then laid a small, decorative silver dish of salted almonds directly on top of it. The entire sequence took no more than 3 seconds. The disaster was not only averted, it was erased. The footman shot her a look of profound, terrified gratitude before retreating. Lady Lavinia, already turning to charm the Duke, had missed the near catastrophe entirely. Cassandra had not even looked up from her wineglass. But one person had seen. Across the room, from his seat of honor, the Duke's gray eyes had not been on Cassandra's brilliant beauty. They had been fixed on the small, unfolding drama by the sideboard. He had watched the footman's error, the spreading stain, and the quiet, efficient intervention. He saw the plain young woman in the simple gray dress, the one who had been introduced with a dismissive wave as "my other niece, Prudence." He watched her perform a small miracle of competence and disappear back into the shadows. He saw her hands, which were not adorned with rings, but were steady and sure. He saw her face, which was not beautiful in the way of Cassandra Corbett, but was composed and intelligent. It was not pity he felt. It was something harder and more respectful. It was recognition. In a house built on performance, he had just witnessed a moment of unadorned, unrewarded reality. He thought of his own home, Kestrel Chase, a place hemorrhaging money, choked by chaos and deceit left behind by his late, beautiful, and catastrophically irresponsible wife. He thought of the mountains of unpaid bills, the forged IOUs, the servants taking advantage of the lack of oversight. He needed order. He needed honesty. He needed competence. He looked at Cassandra, smiling her vacant, practiced smile. Then his eyes drifted back to the shadows where Prudence stood, a silent guardian of a household that did not value her. An idea began to form in his mind. It was a cold, transactional, and utterly mad idea. And it was the first thing that had interested him in a year. Later that night, long after the last guest had departed and Cassandra had gone to bed dreaming of a ducal coronet, Prudence was in her small, cold room at the top of the house. She was not dreaming. She was working. By the light of a single candle, she sat at her small, scarred desk, a large, worn ledger open before her. This was the true heart of the household, a book of numbers that told a story of ruin. Her aunt's dressmaker, 2 years in arrears. The wine merchant, threatening to cut them off. The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, all were owed money that Lady Lavinia simply did not have. Prudence's task was to juggle, to placate, to find pennies where pounds were needed. She dipped her pen in the ink, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had saved 17 shillings this week by finding a new supplier for beeswax candles and 3 shillings on laundry soap. It was a pittance, a single drop of water against a raging fire. But it was something. It was the work she was given. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. They were a currency with no value. Competence, however, had a grim, practical worth, even if she was the only one who knew it. The faint scent of beeswax and old paper filled the small room. It was the scent of her life. She finished her entry, blotted the ink, and closed the ledger. Another day survived. She did not know that across the county, in the cold, grand fortress of Kestrel Chase, a duke was also sitting at his desk, staring not at numbers, but at the memory of a quiet woman in a gray dress who knew how to fix things without asking for a reward. And he was making a calculation of his own. The summons came 2 days later. A footman from Kestrel Chase arrived with a single, thick envelope bearing the ducal seal. It was addressed not to Lady Lavinia, nor to the beautiful Cassandra, but to Miss Prudence Abbott. Lady Lavinia snatched it from the salver before Prudence could even reach for it, her manicured fingers tearing at the wax. "What is this?" she demanded, her eyes scanning the brief, stark message. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to a sharp, calculating avarice that made Prudence's stomach clench. "He wants to see you," Lavinia breathed, her voice a strange mix of awe and suspicion. "The Duke. He requests your presence at Kestrel Chase this afternoon." The journey to Kestrel Chase was a silent, tense affair. Lady Lavinia, having decided this was some eccentric whim, perhaps a prelude to offering Prudence a position as a governess or companion, had insisted on accompanying her. She spent the entire carriage ride issuing a litany of instructions. "Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not offer your opinions. Smile. Be agreeable. Remember your station, Prudence. He is a duke. And for heaven's sake, try not to look so severe." Prudence said nothing. She looked out the window at the rolling hills giving way to the vast, untamed parkland of the ducal estate. The house, when it came into view, was breathtaking and intimidating. Kestrel Chase was not a house, it was a statement. A vast pile of golden stone that seemed to have risen from the earth, commanding the landscape for miles. But as they drew closer, she saw the signs of neglect. The long driveway was rutted and overgrown with weeds. The magnificent gardens were choked with thorns, and several windows on the upper floors were shuttered like blind eyes. The house was in mourning, and it was also in decay. They were shown not into a glittering salon, but into the Duke's private study. It was a deeply masculine room, paneled in dark wood, smelling of leather and cold ashes from a long-dead fire. Bookshelves soared to the ceiling, but they were in disarray, with volumes stacked on the floor and papers spilling from every surface. It was a room of organized chaos, and at its center, behind a desk the size of a small boat, sat Lord Benedict Devereux. He rose as they entered, his height even more imposing than it had seemed at the dinner. He acknowledged Lady Lavinia with a curt nod, but his gray eyes settled on Prudence. "Miss Abbott, thank you for coming." His voice was low and devoid of pleasantry. It was the voice of a man accustomed to command. "Your Grace," Prudence murmured, giving a small curtsy. "I will be plain," he said, wasting no time on social niceties. He gestured for them to sit, though he remained standing. "Lady Lavinia, your finances are in a state of ruin." The statement landed in the silent room like a dropped stone. Lady Lavinia gasped, her face paling. I don't know what you mean. My affairs are perfectly in order." The Duke picked up a thin folio from his desk. "According to my solicitor, you have debts totaling £9,420. Your creditors are on the verge of taking legal action. Within 6 months, you will be homeless and destitute." Lady Lavinia looked as if she had been struck. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. All her careful posturing, her years of performance, had been stripped away in a single brutal sentence. The Duke's gaze shifted back to Prudence. "At the dinner party 2 nights ago, I witnessed you manage a situation with the staff. It was an act of quiet, immediate competence. My own household, Miss Abbott, is in a state of profound disorder. My accounts are a disaster. My late wife—" He paused, and a flicker of something dark and painful crossed his face. "My late wife was not methodical. I require someone to bring order to the chaos, someone with a precise mind, unimpeachable discretion, and no taste for melodrama." He looked directly at Prudence, his eyes holding hers. "My solicitor has made inquiries. He tells me that for the past 5 years, you have single-handedly managed your aunt's household and kept her from bankruptcy. He tells me you are the architect of her survival." Prudence felt a flush creep up her neck. To be seen so suddenly and so completely was a terrifying sensation. She risked a glance at her aunt. Lady Lavinia was staring at her, a look of pure, venomous betrayal in her eyes. "I propose a transaction," the Duke continued, his voice as cold and clear as winter air. "I will settle all of your aunt's debts, every last shilling. She will be free, her reputation intact." Lady Lavinia's head snapped up, her expression turning from fury to greedy hope. "In exchange," the Duke said, his eyes still locked on Prudence, "you will come to Kestrel Chase. You will be given the title of Estate Comptroller. You will have complete authority over the household accounts, the ledgers, the staff budgets, everything. Your task is to find the bottom of this financial pit and then chart a course out of it. You will be paid a salary of £300 per annum, with full board. The arrangement will last for a term of 2 years, at the end of which you will be free to go, with a letter of reference that will open any door in England." It was not a marriage proposal. It was an employment contract. A rescue, but not for her. He was buying her skill to rescue himself, and he was offering to buy her from her jailer. "This is highly irregular," Lady Lavinia stammered, though the prospect of being debt-free had brought a feverish light to her eyes. "It is," the Duke agreed without apology. "But I am a duke, and I am a widower with an estate in crisis. I have little time for what is regular. I require what is effective." He looked at Prudence once more. His voice softened just a fraction. "I am not ordering you, Miss Abbott. The choice is yours. But I am asking. Answer plainly." Prudence looked at her aunt, who was practically vibrating with the desire to accept. She looked at the cold, powerful Duke. She thought of her small room, her endless, thankless work, the constant fear of discovery and ruin. Here was a different path. It was not a path to love or happiness, but it was a path to purpose, to being paid for her worth, to being seen for what she could do, not what she looked like. It was a cage of a different sort, perhaps, but it was a larger one, and the door would be open at the end. She met the Duke's gaze, her own clear and steady. "I accept your terms, Your Grace." "Good," he said, the word clipped. He turned to Lady Lavinia. "My solicitor will call on you tomorrow to settle the accounts. Miss Abbott's belongings should be sent here by the end of the week. She will begin immediately." There was no talk of affection, no pretense of anything other than a stark commercial arrangement. Prudence Abbott, the invisible niece, had been sold. Or, perhaps, for the first time in her life, she had been bought at something approaching her true value. As she left the study, she could feel her aunt's simmering rage behind her, and the Duke's cool, appraising gaze following her. She had just entered into a reluctant alliance with a man made of ice, in a house that seemed frozen in time. And she had no idea that her quiet competence was about to ignite a slow, thawing fire. Prudence arrived at Kestrel Chase 3 days later with a single trunk containing her meager wardrobe and her small, worn, leather-bound ledger. The great house was even more silent and imposing from the inside. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of sunlight, piercing the gloom of the cavernous entrance hall. The air was cold, smelling of damp stone and beeswax polish, but faintly, as if the polishing had been done long ago and with little enthusiasm. A woman stood waiting for her. She was tall and severe, dressed in the starched black silk of a head housekeeper. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. "Miss Abbott," the woman said, her voice crisp and unwelcoming. "I am Mrs. Granger. His Grace has instructed me to show you to your rooms and then to the estate office." There was no warmth in her greeting, only a rigid formality that bordered on hostility.
Prudence understood at once. This woman, Mrs. Hannah Granger, was the guardian of this house, and Prudence was an interloper, a strange creature of indeterminate status brought in by a grieving and unpredictable master. She was a threat to the established order. "Thank you, Mrs. Granger," Prudence replied, her own voice quiet and even. She would not be baited into a confrontation. She would win this woman over with work, not words. The rooms she was given were in a quiet wing of the house. They were spacious and well-appointed, with a bedroom and a small sitting room, but they were also cold and impersonal. A fire had been laid in the grate but not lit. It was clear they were guest rooms, not a place someone was expected to truly inhabit. It suited her. This was a place of employment, not a home. After depositing her trunk, Mrs. Granger led her to what was to be her domain, the estate office. It was not the Duke's grand study, but a smaller, more practical room near the kitchens and servants' quarters. It was, if possible, in even greater chaos than the Duke's study.
Ledgers, some dating back decades, were piled in precarious stacks. Spindles of receipts overflowed onto the floor. The desk was buried under a snowdrift of invoices, letters, and account books bound in cracking leather. "His Grace said you are to have access to everything," Mrs. Granger said, her tone implying this was a grave mistake. "The keys to the storage chests are in the top desk drawer." She paused, her hand on the doorknob. "The late Duchess, her things are still as she left them. His Grace has not permitted anyone to touch her affairs." The unspoken message was clear. You are meddling in the grief of this house. "I understand," Prudence said. "I will be careful." Mrs. Granger gave a stiff nod and departed, leaving Prudence alone in the heart of the chaos she was meant to tame. For a long moment, she simply stood in the center of the room, taking it all in. The scale of the task was immense. It was her aunt's financial disarray magnified 100-fold. But instead of fear, she felt a strange, quiet thrill. This was a puzzle, a vast, complex, and broken machine that she was being asked to fix. She did not start with the towering piles. She started with the room itself. She opened the heavy velvet curtains, letting in the watery afternoon light. She cracked open a window, allowing fresh air to disturb the stale dust. She found a dust cloth and methodically began to wipe down the surfaces, starting with the desk. She was not a housemaid, but she could not work in filth. It was an act of imposing order on the smallest of scales, a prelude to the greater work ahead. Underneath the first layer of papers on the desk, she found it. A small, elegant lap desk made of rosewood and inlaid with mother-of-pearl. It was unmistakably feminine, the late Duchess's. A faint scent of jasmine and dried ink rose from it. Hesitantly, Prudence opened it. Inside were not accounts, but letters, invitations, and a small, half-finished note. Prudence closed it immediately. This was private. This was grief. Mrs. Granger's warning echoed in her mind. She would respect that boundary. The Duke had hired her to untangle his finances, not his memories. She spent the rest of the day, and the next, and the one after that, in that room. She worked with a silent, methodical fury. She began by sorting. Bills in one pile, ledgers in another, correspondence in a third. She requested the staff records from Mrs. Granger, who provided them with grudging reluctance. Prudence discovered that half the staff were being overpaid, and the other half were owed back wages. She found contracts with suppliers charging double the market rate for hay and oats. She found bills for gowns and jewels from London and Paris that cost more than the estate's entire annual profit from its tenant farms. Each discovery was a small, sharp shock. The late Duchess had not simply been extravagant, she had been reckless, a whirlwind of consumption who had treated the Devereux fortune as an infinite resource. And woven through the legitimate, if outrageous, bills, Prudence began to find other things. IOUs written in a flourishing hand, signed by the Duchess, for immense sums of money from private individuals. Loans from men whose names Prudence did not recognize, with exorbitant rates of interest. She did not speak of this to anyone. Each night, after hours in the estate office, she would return to her cold rooms and, by the light of her single candle, she would make notes in her own private ledger. She was not just creating a financial record, she was mapping a history of deceit. The Duke remained a distant, formidable presence. He did not summon her, he did not interfere, but she felt his observation. Sometimes, as she crossed the great hall, she would see him standing on the upper gallery, watching her. Once, late at night, she heard his footsteps pause outside the estate office door. He stood there for a full minute, in complete silence, before walking away.
He was giving her space, letting her work. But he was also waiting.
The first sign of a thaw came not from the Duke, but from the house itself. After her first week, Prudence presented Mrs. Granger with a new, simplified budget for the household. It was not based on arbitrary cuts, but on her meticulous research. She had renegotiated the contract with the butcher in Marley. She had found a new source for flour at a third of the cost. She had calculated the exact amount of coal needed to heat the occupied rooms of the house, rather than trying to heat the entire, vast structure. Mrs. Granger looked over the papers, her expression skeptical. "This is impossible. We cannot run a house this size on so little." "We can," Prudence said calmly, "if we stop the leaks. The wages, for example. I have regularized them. Cook was owed £20. The 2 junior housemaids have been overpaid by 5. I have corrected it, ensuring everyone is paid what they are due, starting this Friday. The money is allocated here." She pointed to a line in the new budget. Mrs. Granger stared at the figures. She knew the cook had been complaining for months. She also knew the housemaids had been boasting of their extra pay. She saw that Prudence had not just cut costs, but had introduced fairness. For the first time, a flicker of respect entered the housekeeper's stern eyes. "I will see to it," she said. The next morning, when Prudence entered her cold sitting room, she found the fire had been lit. A small pot of tea and a single biscuit had been left on a tray by the hearth. It was a small gesture, but in the silent, cold expanse of Kestrel Chase, it felt as momentous as a peal of bells. It was a signal, an acknowledgement. The first loyalty domino had tipped. That afternoon, Prudence took a brief respite from the dusty ledgers. Her head ached from the numbers. She wandered out a side door and found herself in a large, walled garden. It had once been beautiful, she could tell. The ghost of it was still there, in the elegant lines of the stone paths and the gnarled shapes of ancient fruit trees. But now it was a wasteland of weeds and thorns. A statue of a goddess was covered in ivy, her face obscured. A stone bench was cracked, a line of moss growing in the fissure. It mirrored the house. It mirrored the Duke. A place of former beauty, now abandoned to neglect and sorrow. Without thinking, Prudence knelt down and began to pull at the weeds choking a single, resilient rosebush. The thorns pricked her fingers, but she barely noticed. She worked until a small patch of dark, rich earth was cleared around the base of the plant. It was a tiny act of reclamation in a vast wilderness of decay. She did not know that from a high window in his study, The Duke was watching her. He saw her kneeling in the dirt, her plain dress smudged with soil, her brow furrowed in concentration as she freed the rosebush. He had not set foot in that garden since his wife's death. It had been his wife's favorite project, another thing she had started with great enthusiasm and then abandoned when it required more effort than glamour. He had looked at it only with bitterness. But now, watching Prudence perform this small, patient act of restoration, he felt a different emotion. It was not the sharp pang of grief. It was a quiet, stirring sense of hope. He was watching her bring his house, and perhaps himself, slowly back to life. The quiet transformation of Kestrel Chase continued, one small, deliberate act at a time. The fires were lit. The bills were paid. The staff, receiving their wages regularly and fairly for the first time in years, began to work with a renewed sense of purpose. The scent of beeswax was stronger in the halls now, and the sound of footsteps seemed less like an intrusion and more like a rhythm. Prudence's presence was no longer a disruption. It was becoming the new, steady heartbeat of the house. She established a routine.
Mornings were spent in the estate office, untangling the financial knots.
Afternoons, for a single hour, she would retreat to the walled garden. Her small patch of cleared earth grew larger each day. She had found old gardening tools in a forgotten shed and set about her work with the same methodical patience she applied to the ledgers. She uncovered the stone paths, pruned the dead wood from the apple trees, and discovered dormant perennials just waiting for a chance to breathe. Mrs. Granger, seeing her come in one day with dirt under her nails and a flush on her cheeks, had started leaving a pair of sturdy gardening gloves for her by the door, a silent, gruff offering of support. The Duke, Lord Benedict, began to seek out her company. At first it was under the guise of work. He would appear in the estate office in the late afternoon, asking for a specific figure or a progress report.
"Miss Abbott, the account with the grain merchant in Ottersley, have you settled it?"
"Yes, Your Grace. We paid the outstanding balance of £82 yesterday. I have also terminated the contract. Their prices were inflated by 20% compared to the rates at Marley Market. The new supplier will save the estate over £200 a year." She would deliver these facts without flourish, simply presenting the numbers from her neat, newly organized books. He would listen, his expression unreadable, and give a short nod. Good. But slowly the questions changed. They became less about the past and more about the future. "The West Wing," he said one evening, standing by the window of the office, looking out at the darkening grounds. "It has been closed for a year. What would it cost to make it habitable again?" Prudence didn't need to consult her ledgers. She had already done the calculations. To repair the roof, replace the broken window panes, and hire the necessary staff to clean and maintain it would cost approximately £150 for the initial outlay, and an additional £20 a month in wages and supplies. He turned from the window to look at her. "And can the estate bear such a cost?" "Yes," she said simply. "If we postpone the purchase of the new carriage horses until spring. The current stock is adequate for the winter." He considered this. His late wife would have demanded the horses and the wing, and thrown a tantrum when the bills came due. Prudence presented him with choices, with consequences. She treated his fortune not as a magical spring, but as a finite resource to be managed with intelligence. "Postpone the horses," he said. "Open the wing." The conversations began to drift from the purely financial. He asked about the garden. He asked about a book she was reading, which he had spotted on the table in her sitting room. He started calling her Prudence. The first time he did so, the name felt strange and momentous in the quiet room. Prudence, the rosebush you cleared. It was a gift from my grandmother. It's a hardy variety, she replied, her voice soft. It will bloom again, with care. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes beyond grief and command. It was a deep, weary gratitude. It was time for a change in perspective. Benedict's perspective. Benedict stood at his study window, the same window from which he had watched her in the garden. He was not watching her now. He was holding a single, folded piece of paper. It was a list, in her neat, precise hand, of charitable requests from the village of Marley. The vicar needed funds to repair the church roof. The local schoolmistress needed money for books. His late wife, Isabel, had loved charity. She had hosted grand balls, raising thousands of pounds, of which only a pittance ever made it to the intended recipients, after the costs of the champagne, the orchestra, and her own gown were deducted. It was charity as performance. Prudence's list was different. Beside each request, she had written a series of notes. Vicar's request. Verified cost with Marley builder. Sum is accurate. Recommendation. Fund in full. Schoolmistress request. Cost of books seems high. Inquired at stationers. She is being overcharged. Recommendation. Purchase books directly and deliver them. Saving of £4. He ran his thumb over her handwriting. It was like her. Clear, honest, and ruthlessly efficient. He had hired her to be a human calculator, a machine to fix his broken finances. He had expected competence. He had not expected this quiet, unyielding integrity that was seeping into every corner of his life. He thought of the day he had made his shocking proposition. He had seen her as a tool, a solution to a problem. He had purchased her expertise, he thought, to shield himself from the world of feeling and deceit that had destroyed his first marriage. Isabel had been all charm, all beauty, all feeling. And it had all been a lie. Her love had been a performance to mask her addictions to gambling and luxury. The grief he felt was not just for her death, but for the shattering discovery of her betrayal afterward. It had left him numb, sealed in ice. Prudence was Isabel's opposite. She was quiet where Isabel had been loud. She was plain where Isabel had been dazzling. She offered facts where Isabel had offered flattery. And for months, he had found a strange peace in her unemotional presence. But it was no longer peace, he felt. When she looked up from her ledgers and met his gaze, her brown eyes clear and serious, he felt a jolt of something that was not peaceful at all. When he saw her in the garden, her face softened with concentration, he felt a warmth spread through his chest that he had thought himself incapable of feeling. It was not the dizzying infatuation he'd had for Isabel. It was a slow, deep, and terrifying current of respect that was pulling him under. He had built a fortress of ice around his heart, and this quiet, unassuming woman was melting it, not with fire and passion, but with the steady, gentle warmth of a well-tended hearth. He had hired an archivist and found a partner. He had sought a servant and discovered a queen in hiding. And he knew, with a certainty that frightened and thrilled him, that the 2-year term of her employment was a deadline he could no longer bear to face. He was beginning to fall in love with her, and he had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The transaction was becoming a transformation, and the terms of their contract were no longer sufficient to describe what was growing between them.
Prudence's perspective. The first snow of winter fell on Kestrel Chase, blanketing the newly tidy gardens in a sheet of pristine white. Inside, the house was warmer than it had been in years. The west wing was open and aired, its windows clean and bright. The staff moved with a quiet efficiency, and the chill of grief had been replaced by a low hum of activity. The change had not gone unnoticed in the county. Rumours began to circulate in Marley. The mad Duke of Kestrel Chase, who had locked himself away for a year, was emerging. The estate was solvent, the house was coming alive, and it was all credited to the mysterious, plain niece of Lady Lavinia Corbett, who was living at the Chase in some undefined, scandalous capacity. The first shot in the escalating war was fired by Lady Lavinia herself. She began to pay calls on her neighbours, her voice dripping with false concern. "Poor Prudence," she would sigh, dabbing a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. "She is so earnest. I do worry the Duke is taking advantage of her good nature. A young, unmarried woman living in that great house with a man of his reputation. It is most improper. I pray for her virtue." The whispers were poison, spreading from drawing room to drawing room. Prudence was an adventuress, a schemer, a fortune hunter who was taking advantage of a grieving man. Then, Mr.
Fletcher Sinclair arrived. He was announced one afternoon as Prudence was going over the quarterly farm rents. He was handsome, impeccably dressed, and radiated an oily charm that set her teeth on edge. He introduced himself as a dear, dear friend of the late Duchess. "I was so devastated to hear of Isabel's passing," he said, his voice smooth as honey. "I have been abroad and only just heard. I came at once to pay my respects to the Duke." Prudence's internal alarm bells, honed by years of dealing with her aunt's duplicitous creditors, were screaming. She recognized his name, Fletcher Sinclair. It was written on 3 of the largest and most suspicious IOUs she had found in the late Duchess's lap desk, totaling a staggering £15,000. "His Grace is not receiving visitors," Prudence said, her tone polite but firm. Sinclair's smile did not falter. "Ah, but I am not a visitor. I am a creditor." He produced a black leather wallet and extracted one of the IOUs. "A small matter of a loan I made to dear Isabel. For her charities, of course. I'm sure the Duke will want to settle it immediately, to protect her memory." Prudence looked at the document. The interest rate specified was extortionate. "All claims against the estate are to be submitted to me in writing," she said, her voice cold. "I will review it and present it to His Grace at the appropriate time." Sinclair's charming mask slipped for a fraction of a second. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He had expected to deal with a grieving, pliable Duke, not this quiet, unmovable gatekeeper. "My dear Miss Abbott," he purred, "this is a private matter between gentlemen, not something for a lady to trouble her pretty head over." "The finances of Kestrel Chase are precisely what I trouble my head over, Mr. Sinclair," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Submit your claim in writing." He saw then that he would not be able to intimidate her. He bowed, his smile returning, but his eyes were hard. "As you wish. But a word of advice. The Duke is a man of deep feeling. He would be devastated to think his late wife's honour was being questioned by an employee." The threat was clear. Challenge the debt, and he would paint her as a villain, besmirching the memory of the sainted Duchess. He left, but his presence lingered like a bad smell. He did not leave the county. He took rooms in Marley
and began to be seen everywhere, often in the company of Lady Lavinia Corbett. The two streams of poison merged into a flood. The story they wove was a masterpiece of malice. Prudence, the scheming niece, was not only seducing the Duke, but was systematically trying to destroy his first wife's reputation to elevate her own. She was telling him lies, convincing him the Duchess had been a spendthrift, turning him against the memory of the woman he had loved. And Fletcher Sinclair, the loyal friend, was fighting to protect that memory. The county, which loved gossip more than truth, began to turn. Invitations that had started to trickle in for the Duke, cautiously welcoming him back into society, now specified His Grace alone. Shopkeepers in the village grew cooler. Prudence felt the shift in the air, the averted eyes, the sudden silences when she entered a room. That is how counties turn on their own. Quietly, by degrees. She said nothing of this to the Duke. She would not burden him with whispers and rumours. Her job was to deal in facts and figures. She continued her work, her face a mask of calm composure. But inside, a cold knot of dread was tightening. The antagonists were no longer just sniping from a distance. They were organised. They were collaborating. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were planning a direct attack. The rumours were just the artillery barrage before the main assault. The attack came on a Tuesday, a cold grey afternoon when the sky hung low and heavy over Kestrel Chase.
Prudence was in the estate office, finalizing the annual accounts. The numbers were finally beginning to make sense. The estate was not yet prosperous, but it was solvent. The bleeding had stopped. She felt a quiet satisfaction in the neat columns of figures, a testament to months of tireless work. The Duke entered without knocking, his face a thundercloud. It was a look she had never seen on him before. Not grief, not weariness, but a raw, blazing anger. In his hand, he held a single sheet of pale blue stationery. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. He threw the letter onto the desk in front of her. Prudence picked it up. The paper was expensive, scented faintly with the same jasmine perfume as the late Duchess's lap desk. The handwriting was a looping, feminine scrawl. It was a letter, supposedly from her, addressed to her aunt, Lady Lavinia. "Dearest Aunt," it began, "you will be delighted to hear that our plan is succeeding beyond our wildest dreams. The fish has taken the bait completely. He hangs on my every word, believing all my little stories about the estate's finances. He is so blinded by his grief, he cannot see that I am making myself indispensable. He speaks of opening the West Wing. Soon, he will be speaking of a new Duchess. The memory of that dreadful spendthrift Isabel will be erased, and Kestrel Chase will be mine. Your patience will be rewarded, I promise you. Your loving niece, Prudence." The words were a vile caricature of everything she felt, a twisted reflection of her work. The forgery was clever. The handwriting was a passable imitation of her own, but looser, more flamboyant. The details, the West Wing, the financial stories, were things that could have been gleaned from gossip or a well-placed servant. "I did not write this," she said, her voice coming out as a near whisper. She looked up at him, her heart pounding. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were filled with a terrible, wounded light. The betrayal he had suffered at his first wife's hands had left a deep, unhealed wound, and this letter had just torn it wide open. He was primed to believe in the deceit of a woman who had gotten close to him. "Did you not?" he asked, his voice laced with ice. It seems to be in your hand. It speaks of things only you would know. It confirms every rumor that has been circulating for weeks. It is a forgery, she insisted, her own voice gaining a sliver of strength. Look at the handwriting. It is similar, but it is not mine. My penmanship is more precise. The loops are smaller. A convenient distinction, he sneered, the sound ugly and foreign from his lips. You are a woman of meticulous detail, are you not? Perhaps you are meticulous in your deceptions as well. Each word was a physical blow. The trust that had been so slowly, so carefully built between them was shattering like glass. He was seeing her not as Prudence, but as a ghost of his first wife. Another beautiful lie. And then he said the words that broke her. I see now, he said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous murmur. The quiet competence. The endless work. It was all just another performance. A different sort of seduction. You were never truly here for the work, or for this house. You were playing the part of a duchess in waiting. The injustice of it stole her breath. All her labor, all her patient restoration, all the nascent, unspoken feelings she had begun to harbor for him, all of it dismissed as a cynical charade. She thought of the hours spent in the cold office, the thorns that had pricked her fingers in the garden, the quiet satisfaction of bringing a broken thing back to life. All of it, in his eyes, was now a lie. Something inside her, a core of quiet dignity she had preserved through years of her aunt's tyranny, refused to break. She would not weep. She would not beg. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. She stood up, her back straight, her hands clasped before her to still their trembling. She met his furious, wounded gaze. That is not my letter, she said, her voice low but perfectly clear. That is not my handwriting. And that is not my heart. She held his gaze for a long, silent moment. She saw the war in his eyes, the deep, instinctual pain of past betrayal fighting against the months of evidence he had of her character. He wanted to believe the letter because it fit the narrative of his first great wound. It was easier to believe in a new betrayal than in the possibility of a new, genuine trust. Prove it, he said, the words a raw challenge. The demand hung in the air between them. How could she prove a negative? How could she disprove a lie so perfectly crafted to destroy her? The letter was a work of art, designed to be irrefutable. Lady Lavinia and Fletcher Sinclair had planned their attack well. But Prudence Abbott was a woman of evidence. Her entire life was built on facts, figures, and documentation. She looked from his face to the forged letter, then to the neat stacks of ledgers and account books that now filled the office. Her mind, her greatest asset, began to work. The panic receded, replaced by a cold, clear focus. Very well, she said, her voice steady now. I will. She looked at him, and her expression was no longer that of a wounded employee, but of a peer. But you will have to trust me, just for a little while longer. You will have to trust the woman you have watched work for 6 months over the piece of paper you have held for 5 minutes. His anger had not subsided, but a flicker of uncertainty had entered his eyes. Her refusal to crumble, her calm and direct response, was not the reaction of a guilty party caught in a lie. It was the response of an innocent person facing a grave injustice. What do you propose? He asked, his tone still harsh, but the sneer was gone. "I propose a dinner," she said, the idea forming as she spoke. "A grand dinner party, here at Kestrel Chase. The first since your mourning period ended. We will invite the most influential families in the county. And we will invite my aunt, Lady Lavinia. And we will invite Mr. Fletcher Sinclair." He stared at her as if she were mad. "You want to invite the people who are trying to destroy you into my home?" "I want to invite them into our home," she corrected him gently, then immediately regretted the slip. But she pressed on. "And yes, because lies like this fester in the dark. They wither in the light. If I am to be tried, let it be in public. Let them make their accusations to my face, in front of witnesses, and let me present my defense." He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on her face, searching. He was weighing the poison of the letter against the quiet truth of her presence. He was a man who prized evidence. She was offering him a chance to see it presented, in full. It was a gamble, a piece of high theater, and everything depended on his willingness to take that risk with her. "And if you are wrong?" he finally asked. "If they prove their case? You will have humiliated me in front of the entire county." "If they prove their case," Prudence replied, her voice unwavering, "then I will leave Kestrel Chase before midnight. You will never have to see me again." The stakes were laid bare. Her reputation, his honor, the future of the house. He walked over to the window and stared out at the snow-covered garden, his back to her. 1 second. 2. 3. The silence in the room was absolute. She watched the rigid line of his shoulders, waiting for her sentence. Finally, he turned back to her. The fire in his eyes had been banked, replaced by a cold, grim resolve. "Draw up a guest list," he said, "and tell Mrs. Granger to prepare the grand dining hall. We will have our dinner. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel." The week leading up to the dinner was the longest of Prudence's life. She and the Duke moved around each other with a fragile, unspoken truce. The warmth that had been growing between them was gone, replaced by a tense, formal courtesy. He was holding his judgment in reserve, and the weight of his doubt was a constant physical presence. He had agreed to her plan, but he had not yet exonerated her in his heart. The crisis was not resolved. It was merely suspended. Prudence, however, did not have time for anxiety. She had a case to build. She spent every waking hour in the estate office, but she was no longer just organizing. She was investigating. She gathered samples of her own handwriting from dozens of sources, daily menus she had written for the cook, notes to the stable master, and, most importantly, the meticulous entries in her daily account books. She placed them side by side with the forged letter. To a casual observer, the resemblance was strong. To her, the differences were as clear as night and day. The pressure of the pen, the spacing of the words, the precise, almost cramped formation of her capital letters versus the forgery's confident flourish. But that was not enough. It was her word against theirs. She needed more. She needed irrefutable evidence. Her mind turned to Mr. Fletcher Sinclair. His claim of £15,000 was the key. She dove back into the late Duchess's records, this time looking not just for spending, but for a pattern. She cross-referenced the dates of Sinclair's IOUs with the Duchess's private calendar and bank withdrawals. A picture began to emerge. The Duchess had been a gambler. Not just extravagant, but addicted. The dates of the loans corresponded with race meetings at Newmarket, and clandestine card parties in London. Sinclair was not a friend offering a loan. He was a predator, a loan shark who had preyed on a desperate woman, charging her criminal rates of interest and likely encouraging her habit. Then she found the final piece. Tucked into the back of an old almanac in the Duchess's desk was a small, folded note. It was a list of names and figures, written in the Duchess's frantic, looping hand. Beside Sinclair's name was the sum of £5,000 with the word "paid" written next to it, and a date. He was claiming a debt that had already been at least partially settled. He was a fraud. The last piece of her plan involved an ally. She sent a discreet message to the one person in the county she felt she could trust, the Duke's grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, Lady Theodosia Devereux. Lady Theodosia was a formidable old woman, with eyes that missed nothing and a tongue as sharp as a razor. She had visited Kestrel Chase once since Prudence's arrival, and had observed her with a keen, appraising gaze, making a few dry comments about the improved quality of the tea and the distinct lack of dust on the banisters. Prudence requested a private meeting. Lady Theodosia received her in her dower house in Marley. Prudence laid out the situation plainly, without emotion. She presented the forged letter and explained her suspicions about Sinclair. The Dowager Duchess listened, her hawk-like eyes fixed on Prudence's face. When she was finished, the old woman took the forged letter and examined it through her lorgnette. "This is a clumsy piece of work," she sniffed. "The forger has tried to imitate a woman's hand, but has the heavy downward strokes of a man. A vain man, I'd wager. Look at that ostentatious S." She tapped the signature on Sinclair's IOU, which Prudence had also brought. "The same vanity. And as for Lavinia Corbett, she was always a fool, and a greedy one at that." She looked at Prudence. "My grandson is a good man, but he was made a fool of by a pretty face once before. It has made him cautious to a fault." She handed the letter back. "What do you need from me?" "I need a witness," Prudence said. "An expert."
Is there a man in Marley, a clerk or a solicitor, who is known for his unimpeachable honesty and his expertise in documents? Lady Theodosia's thin lips curved into a rare smile.
"Mr. Yardley, the magistrate's clerk. He can spot a forged signature from 20 paces. He is also a dreadful gossip, which will be useful when this is all over."
Her eyes gleamed.
"I will see to it that Mr. Yardley is available for a consultation on the evening of the dinner. Consider it done."
The night of the dinner arrived. Kestrel Chase was ablaze with light. For the first time in over a year, the grand dining hall was in use. The long table gleamed with polished silver and crystal, reflecting the light of 100 candles. The most powerful families of the county were gathered, their curiosity palpable. They had all heard the rumors, and they had come to see the drama unfold. Prudence wore her best dress, a simple gown of dark blue silk. She had no jewels, only the quiet confidence of a woman who had prepared her case. She stood beside the Duke as they received their guests. He was a pillar of cold formality, his face unreadable, but she felt the tension radiating from him. Lady Lavinia and Cassandra arrived, Lavinia triumphant, Cassandra merely bored. And then came Mr. Fletcher Sinclair, exuding charm and confidence. He bowed low over Prudence's hand, his eyes glinting with malice. "Miss Abbott," he murmured, "you look lovely. A special occasion?"
"A night for settling accounts, Mr. Sinclair," she replied, her voice level.
The dinner was a masterpiece of tension. The conversation was stilted, the air thick with unspoken questions. The Duke was a silent, brooding host. Prudence was a calm, watchful presence. Finally, as the dessert plates were cleared, the Duke rose. A hush fell over the room. "I thank you all for coming," he began, his voice ringing with authority. "I have not been a sociable host of late. There has been much disorder in my house, and much gossip in the county. Tonight we will have order, and we will have truth." He looked down the table at Lady Lavinia and Mr. Sinclair, who both wore faint, knowing smiles. "It has been brought to my attention," the Duke continued, his voice like ice, "that the woman who has brought order back to my house, Miss Prudence Abbott, has done so under false pretenses. That she is an adventuress who has manipulated me and sought to ruin the reputation of my late wife." Gasps rippled through the room. Lady Lavinia dabbed her eye with a handkerchief. "A terrible business, Your Grace. I am so sorry you had to find out." "Indeed," the Duke said, his eyes still locked on her. He produced the forged letter. "I have here a letter, purportedly from Miss Abbott to you, Lady Lavinia, confessing to this very scheme." Sinclair leaned forward. "A tragedy, but it is best that it is in the open. A man must protect himself from such machinations." "I agree," the Duke said. He turned to Prudence. "Miss Abbott, you have heard the accusation. What do you have to say in your defense?" This was it, the public trial she had requested. Prudence rose from her seat. She did not look flustered or afraid. She looked like what she was, a master of her subject. "I say that the letter is a forgery," she said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the room. "And I say that the accusation is a lie, constructed by two people who have cause to fear my work at Kestrel Chase." She looked at her aunt. "Lady Lavinia, for 5 years I managed your accounts. You lived a life of luxury on the brink of ruin, a fact you concealed from the world, and a fact which I, out of family loyalty, helped you to hide. The Duke's offer to employ me was contingent on him clearing your debts. You were not losing a niece. You were escaping a debtor's prison. But you grew greedy. You wanted your daughter to be the Duchess, and you saw me as an obstacle." She then turned to Sinclair. "And you, Mr. Sinclair,
You presented yourself as a friend to the late Duchess, but you were a predator. You loaned her money at criminal rates of interest to feed a gambling habit she hid from my husband." She used the word without thinking. My husband. A collective intake of breath went around the table. She did not correct herself. "You are currently claiming a debt of £15,000 from this estate." "It is a valid debt of honor," Sinclair blustered, his face reddening. "Is it?" Prudence asked softly. She produced the note she had found, the one in the late Duchess's hand. "I have here a memorandum written by the Duchess herself, indicating a payment to you of £5,000 against that very loan." She held it up. "Furthermore, the IOUs you hold are for cash, but my review of the late Duchess's bank records shows no corresponding deposits. Where did the money go, Mr. Sinclair? Or was there never any cash at all? Was it merely gambling markers, which are legally unenforceable debts?" Sinclair was speechless, his face a mask of fury. "And now, the letter," Prudence said, turning back to the assembled guests. "I maintain it is a forgery, and I have brought an expert to confirm it." On cue, the dining room doors opened, and Lady Theodosia entered, followed by a small, bespectacled man clutching a satchel. "Apologies for the interruption, Benedict," the Dowager Duchess said breezily. "But you seemed to be in the middle of a business meeting, and I brought your man of affairs, Mr. Yardley. I believe you are needed." Mr. Yardley, the magistrate's clerk, stepped forward. The Duke handed him the forged letter, along with a page from one of Prudence's household ledgers. The clerk produced a magnifying glass and spent a full minute examining both documents in silence. "Well?" the Duke demanded. Mr. Yardley cleared his throat. "Your Grace," he announced. "The two samples were not written by the same hand. The ledger shows a classic clerk's hand, precise, controlled, with consistent pressure. The letter, this is a forgery, and not a particularly skilled one. The writer is attempting to be fluid and feminine, but the underlying structure is angular and heavy-handed. As the Dowager Duchess noted, the letter S is particularly arrogant." He glanced at Fletcher Sinclair. The room erupted in murmurs. Lady Lavinia had gone deathly pale. Sinclair looked trapped. But Prudence had one final, devastating blow to deliver. It was a piece of information she had held in reserve, a question based on her intimate knowledge of her aunt's true, chaotic finances. She looked directly at Lady Lavinia, her voice quiet but carrying a deadly precision. "Aunt," she said, "when the Duke's solicitor settled your debts, there was one creditor from long ago he could not locate. A dressmaker from our time in Bath, a Mrs. Bellamy, to whom you owed £32.06 for a court gown you wore in 1812. A gown you told me was a gift. Do you recall the matter?" Lady Lavinia, flustered and panicking, saw a chance to reassert her knowledge. "Of course I recall, but you are mistaken, Prudence. It was not Mrs. Bellamy. It was a Mrs. Trent, and the sum was closer to £40. Your memory is failing you." A terrible silence fell. Prudence had not moved. She had not raised her voice. She had simply laid the trap, and her aunt had walked directly into it. "There was no Mrs. Bellamy," Prudence said, her voice filled with a quiet, devastating pity. "There was no dressmaker in Bath. I invented her just now. The largest single debt you left in Bath was to a livery stable for £17. You have just lied about a matter of your own finances in front of 30 people, just as you have lied about me." It was over. The lie was not just exposed, it was dismembered piece by piece with the cold, sharp tools of fact and memory. Lady Lavinia stared at Prudence, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Her carefully constructed world shattered. Fletcher Sinclair, seeing the game was up, pushed his chair back and stood, his face white with rage. "This is an outrage, an ambush," he snarled. "It is a reckoning," the Duke's voice boomed, cutting through the noise. He had been watching Prudence throughout her entire defense, and the coldness in his face had been replaced by a look of profound, staggering awe. He rose to his full height, a figure of absolute authority. "Mr. Sinclair, you will leave my house. If you attempt to press your fraudulent claim, I will see you prosecuted for extortion. Lady Lavinia, you will also leave. The carriage that brought you will take you home. I suggest you consider a long, quiet retirement in the country, a very distant part of the country." He looked around at his stunned guests. "You have all witnessed the truth. Let there be no more gossip. Let there be no more lies." Humiliated and exposed, Lady Lavinia and Sinclair were ushered out of the room, their social standing in the county utterly destroyed. Cassandra followed her mother,
looking more bewildered than malicious, a pawn in a game she had never understood. The public reckoning was complete. Prudence Abbott stood vindicated, not by a man's protection, but by her own mind, her own integrity, and her own courage. In the stunned, electric silence that followed the antagonist's departure, the remaining guests sat frozen, unsure of what to do. The drama had been more potent than any wine. Lady Theodosia, with a look of immense satisfaction, broke the spell. "Well," she declared to the room at large, "that was bracing. Far more entertaining than cards." She gave a sharp nod to her grandson, a look that said, "Well, boy, what are you waiting for?" Benedict needed no further prompting. The last vestiges of his doubt had not just been erased, they had been incinerated by the bright, clean fire of Prudence's defense. He had witnessed her not only prove her innocence, but demonstrate a courage and intelligence that humbled him. He had accused her of performing, and she had responded by delivering the most profound and honest truth his house had heard in a decade. He turned away from his guests, from his grandmother, from the entire world. There was only one person in the room. He walked the length of the long dining table until he stood before Prudence. She was still standing by her chair, her hands clasped, her face pale but composed. She met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw not triumph, but a deep, weary sadness for the trust that had been broken between them. "Miss Abbott," he began, his voice low, intended for her alone, yet it carried in the silent room. Then he stopped. "No," he said, his voice growing stronger, clearer. "Prudence." He looked at her, and all the ice, all the grief, all the guarded pain of the past year melted away, leaving only a raw, open sincerity. "I have been a fool twice over," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "Once for being deceived by a beautiful lie, and a second, more terrible time, for doubting the only truly honest person I have met in my life." He did not apologize for his doubt. An apology was insufficient for the wound he had inflicted. He sought to mend it with a declaration. In front of the assembled gentry of Marley, he slowly went down on one knee. A collective gasp went through the room. Prudence's own breath caught in her throat. She looked down at the Duke of Kestrel Chase, this powerful, proud man, kneeling before her on the polished floor. "I hired you to be my comptroller," he said, his eyes, now shining with an emotion she had never seen in them before, fixed on hers. "I asked you to bring order to my house. But you have brought it light. You have brought it truth. You have brought it life." He reached out and took her hands. They were cold, but he held them firmly in his own warm ones. "The title of Duchess of Kestrel Chase is not a prize to be won by scheming.
It is a position that requires honesty, intelligence, and a strength of character that I have witnessed tonight and for the past 6 months. It is a role that you, and you alone, are fit to occupy." He paused, his grip on her hands tightening. He was not rescuing her. He was not rewarding her. He was recognizing her. He was seeing her, completely and utterly for who she was. "The contract for your employment is terminated," he said, a faint, wry smile touching his lips for the first time that night. I would like to propose a new one, a permanent one. I am asking you to be my wife, to be my partner, to stand beside me, not behind me. The house needs you, and I need you." His voice dropped to a near whisper, a raw admission of vulnerability. "Prudence Abbott, will you have me?" Tears she had refused to shed in the face of accusation now welled in her eyes. But they were not tears of pain or humiliation. They were tears of profound, overwhelming joy. The joy of being seen, of being valued, of being chosen. She looked down at this man, her Duke, her Benedict, and she thought of the long, lonely years, the invisible labor, the quiet endurance. It had all led to this. Not to a rescue, but to a choice. Her choice. She smiled, a real, radiant smile that transformed her plain face into something beautiful. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and sure. "Plainly, Benedict. Yes." He rose to his feet, his face alight with a happiness that made him look like a different man. He did not kiss her, not yet. The declaration was too new, too sacred for a public display. Instead, he simply stood before her, holding her hands, a silent, binding promise passing between them in front of all the world. The reckoning was over. The partnership was just beginning. And before midnight, Prudence Abbott, who had arrived as a purchased employee, had been asked to become the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, not for her beauty or her connections, but for the fierce, quiet power of her own unimpeachable worth. 1 year later, the walled garden at Kestrel Chase was unrecognizable. Where there had been thorns and weeds, there were now meticulously tended beds of roses, lavender, and herbs. The stone paths were clear, and the statue of the goddess, now free of ivy, seemed to smile down on the riot of color and life. The late autumn sun cast a golden glow over everything, a gentle warmth that belied the coming winter. Prudence, Duchess of Kestrel Chase, walked along one of the paths, a pair of gardening shears in her hand. She wore a simple wool dress, practical for the outdoors, her hair pinned up simply. She was not adorned with the famous Devereux jewels, which now sat in their vault, but her face had a luminous, serene beauty that no diamond could match. Happiness had been her finest adornment. Benedict came up behind her, his footsteps silent on the grass verge. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Hiding from your duties, Your Grace?" he murmured into her ear. She leaned back against him, a comfortable, familiar gesture. "I am performing my most important duty, Your Grace," she retorted with a smile. "Inspecting the state of the damask roses. Mrs. Granger is convinced we will have enough petals for potpourri to last us through 2 winters." Mrs. Granger, once the stern and suspicious guardian of the house, was now Prudence's most devoted ally and co-conspirator in all matters of household management and horticulture. The housekeeper had been one of the first to see Prudence's true worth, and her loyalty was as fierce and unyielding as her former skepticism. "A worthy cause," Benedict said, his voice rumbling with quiet amusement. He pointed toward the far end of the garden, where a new glass house was being constructed, the frame already glistening in the sun. Mr. Yardley was right. He is a dreadful gossip. The story of our dinner party has become a local legend. The glasshouse builder told me yesterday he heard you cross-examine Sinclair with a single, perfectly sharpened quill. Prudence laughed. The legend seems to be improving with time. The aftermath of that night had been swift and decisive. Fletcher Sinclair had vanished from the county, his reputation in tatters. Lady Lavinia had sold her house and retreated to a small, grim cottage in Wales, from which she sent occasional, complaining letters. Prudence answered them politely, but she sent no money. Some consequences had to be permanent. Her cousin, Cassandra, had surprised everyone. Freed from her mother's ambitions, she had made a modest but happy marriage to a country solicitor, and seemed, for the first time, genuinely content. She and Prudence exchanged letters, a tentative, imperfect bridge being built between them. Lady Theodosia, the Dowager Duchess, was a frequent and welcome visitor. She would sit in the garden with Prudence, offering sharp, witty commentary on the world, and unsolicited but excellent advice on rose cultivation. She had declared Prudence the best thing to happen to her grandson, and the Devereux line in 50 years. Benedict turned Prudence in his arms to face him. He looked down at her, his grey eyes, once so cold, now filled with a deep, steady warmth. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, his expression serious. "This life? It was not what you were raised for." "I was raised to be invisible," she said softly, reaching up to touch his cheek. "I was trained to manage ruin. You, Benedict, have taught me how to build. You have made me visible. How could I ever regret that?" He bent his head and kissed her, a long, slow kiss filled with the quiet comfort of a year of shared days and nights, of partnership and deep, abiding love. The passion was there, a steady, burning flame, but it was banked by a profound and peaceful intimacy. Their life together was a quiet rhythm of shared purpose. In the evenings, they would often work together in the Duke's study, the grand room, now tidy and welcoming. He would be at his desk, going over estate matters, while she sat in a comfortable chair by the fire, going over her own household accounts. Sometimes he would simply stop what he was doing and watch her, a look of quiet wonder on his face, as if he still couldn't quite believe his good fortune. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out. It was her old ledger, the small, worn, leather-bound book she had brought with her on her first day, the one that had held the secrets of her aunt's debts and had become the repository of her first investigations into Kestrel Chase. "I was cleaning out the old estate office," he said. "It's going to be a nursery now. I found this at the back of a drawer." Prudence took the ledger from him. Its pages were filled with her neat, precise script, a history of her former life. She ran her fingers over the worn cover. This book represented her years of silent, thankless toil. It was the symbol of her competence, the tool of her vindication. "What will you do with it?" Benedict asked. She looked from the ledger to the thriving garden, to the warm, solid man standing before her, to the great house that was now her home, alive and breathing around them. She walked over to the newly lit bonfire of garden clippings, the smoke curling lazily into the crisp autumn air. For a moment, she held the book over the flames, thinking of all the pain and loneliness it represented. But then she drew it back. It was not a symbol of pain. It was a symbol of her strength. It was the story of how she had survived. "I think," she said, turning back to him with a smile, "I will keep it. I will use it for the garden, to sketch the new beds, to press flowers, to note down when the first snowdrops appear."
She was not erasing the past. She was transforming it. She was taking the record of her endurance and turning it into a record of her joy.
Benedict came and stood beside her, slipping his arm around her shoulders. Together, they watched the smoke from the bonfire rise into the clear blue sky. The house stood behind them, a bastion of stone and glass, no longer a cold fortress of grief, but a warm, vibrant home, restored and redeemed. Prudence had not been rescued from her life. She had, through her own quiet dignity and strength, built a new one, and in doing so, had allowed the man she loved to build one with her. The accounts were settled, the ledger was balanced, and the future stretched before them, as full of promise as the garden in spring. 2 years after the garden bonfire, the nursery in the old estate office was filled with the sounds of a baby's laughter. Little Arthur Devereux, a boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's calm, observant nature, was the new, undisputed center of Kestrel Chase. The house, once silent, now echoed with a different kind of life. Not the frantic energy of parties, but the gentle, happy hum of a growing family. Prudence sat in a rocking chair by the nursery window, the baby asleep in her arms. The small, worn ledger lay open in her lap. It was no longer a book of numbers and debts. Its pages were now filled with charming, if amateurish, sketches of flowers, pressed leaves from the great oak on the lawn, and notes written in her familiar, precise hand. April 10th. First crocus appeared. Arthur smiled at the color yellow. Benedict brought me 3. May 2nd. The dowager's rose bush is covered in buds. She says it's the best it has looked in 20 years. She also says Arthur has my sensible eyebrows. Each entry was a small monument to a quiet, joyful moment. The book that had once been her shield and her weapon in a world of deceit had become the chronicle of her peace. Benedict came in, treading softly so as not to wake the baby. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, then looked down at the sleeping child in her arms. A look of profound, gentle love transformed his face, smoothing away the last harsh lines that grief had carved there. "Lady Theodosia is holding court in the drawing room," he whispered. "She's telling anyone who will listen that our son has the strategic mind of a field marshal because he managed to get Cook to give him a piece of sugared biscuit." Prudence smiled. "Cook is no match for him. He is your son, after all. He knows how to get what he wants." "He is our son," Benedict corrected her softly, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. "He has your integrity. I pray he has your integrity." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out the window at the sprawling lands of the estate. The tenant farms were prospering, the woods were well managed, and the village of Marley regarded its Duke and Duchess with a fierce, protective pride. The story of their public reckoning had passed into legend, a cautionary tale for schemers and a testament to the quiet woman who had won the Duke's heart not with beauty, but with brains and bravery. Later that evening, after Arthur was asleep in his cot and the house had settled into its nightly quiet, Prudence and Benedict sat by the fire in their study. He was reading a report from his estate manager, and she was mending a tiny tear in one of Arthur's blankets. It was a scene of such simple, profound domesticity that it sometimes still took her breath away. "I received a letter from Cassandra today," she said, biting off a thread. "Her husband has been made a partner in his law firm. They are expecting their first child in the spring." "That is good news," Benedict said, lowering his report. "Will you invite them to visit?" "I think so," Prudence said. "It is time." Forgiveness was not a single act, but a process, like tending a garden. It required patience and care. Benedict put his papers aside and came to sit on the footstool at her feet, leaning his head against her knees. She ran her fingers through his hair. "Do you remember that first day?" he asked, his voice muffled. "When you came to my study with your aunt. I thought I was so clever. I thought I was making a cold, rational decision, buying a tool to fix a problem." "I thought I was accepting a position of employment," she replied, her voice soft with memory. "A very strange position, but employment nonetheless." He turned his head to look up at her, his eyes full of a love that still, after all this time, made her heart ache with its intensity. "I was a fool. I wasn't buying a comptroller. I was finding the missing half of my own soul. I just didn't know it yet. We were two very lonely, very serious people who needed each other, Benedict," she said simply. "We just took a rather unusual path to find our way together." He took her hand, the one that was not holding the mending, and brought it to his lips, kissing her palm. "Thank you," he whispered against her skin. "For what?" "For being you," he said. "For your honesty, for your courage, for showing me that a home is not built with stone and mortar, but with trust, and for loving me, even when I was an idiot." She smiled down at him, her heart full. The journey had been hard, the path fraught with injustice and doubt, but the destination, this quiet moment by the fire with the man she loved, was more than she had ever dared to dream of. She was not the invisible niece, not the transactional employee, not the Duchess in waiting. She was Prudence Devereux, Duchess of Kestrel Chase, a wife, a mother, and a partner. She was home, and the ledger of her life was finally, perfectly, in balance. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.